Before we start, let me ask you something. Have you ever driven for hours, not seeing another car, not passing a house, not even seeing a fence? Just road, red dirt, sky. And that quiet moment hits you, where you realise how small you really are. Australia has thousands of places like that, and most Australians will never see them. Because while we talk about cities, beaches and landmarks, there's another Australia that exists far away from all of that, an Australia built on isolation. This video isn't about tourist towns. It's not about places you see on postcards. It's about towns that existed because people needed them to exist, and in many cases still do. Places where distance wasn't an inconvenience, it was life. Places so isolated that if something went wrong, help wasn't minutes away, it was days. If you're younger, some of these towns might sound unbelievable, but if you're an older Aussie, you might remember a time when this kind of isolation was normal, when long drives weren't entertainment, they were necessity, when maps were paper, when radios mattered, and when you couldn't just look it up. These are Australia's most isolated towns you probably never heard of, and once you hear about them, you'll understand a different side of this country. Australia is often described as a young nation, but the land itself is ancient, unforgiving, and vast beyond comprehension. Most people live along the edges of it, the coast, the cities, the places where life feels connected. But the centre is something else entirely. It's quiet, it's empty, and it doesn't care if you're prepared or not. And yet, people built towns there anyway. Not because they wanted comfort, but because work, survival, and opportunity pulled them in. One of the most famous of these places is Birdsville in far western Queensland. Today, Birdsville gets attention once a year during the races. Planes land, crowds arrive, and suddenly the town feels alive. But for the rest of the year, and for most of its history, Birdsville has been isolated in a way few people truly understand. It sits more than 1,000 kilometres from Brisbane, surrounded by desert that doesn't forgive mistakes. There were times when the only way in or out was a single road, and when rain came, that road disappeared. Supplies didn't arrive on time, they arrived when they could. Mail wasn't daily, sometimes it was weekly, sometimes longer. And if you needed something urgently, you learned to live without it. In Birdsville, self-reliance wasn't a mindset. It was survival. People didn't ask for help unless they absolutely had to. And when they did, help came from neighbours, not systems. Then there's Coober Pedy in South Australia, a town that looks almost abandoned at first glance. Flat ground, scattered buildings, nothing that hints at a community, until you realise most of it is underground. Coober Pedy is one of the few places in the world where people looked at extreme heat and said, "We'll live beneath it." Homes carved into rock, churches dug by hand, entire lives lived below the surface. This wasn't innovation for comfort, it was adaptation for survival. The heat above ground could be brutal, so people went where the earth could protect them, and they stayed. Isolation didn't scare people away, it shaped them. Travel a little further, and you'll find Tibooburra, tucked into the far northwest of New South Wales, closer to other states than to Sydney. Tibooburra never pretended to be important. It didn't need to. It existed because people passed through, drovers, workers, travellers with nowhere else to stop, and like many isolated towns, the pub became the centre of everything. News was shared there, help was found there, and stories were born there. Stories that still get told today, usually starting with, "You wouldn't believe this," but isolation does that. It turns everyday moments into memories worth keeping. Western Australia takes isolation to another level. Distances stretch further, roads feel endless, and towns like Warrakurna sit quietly, almost unnoticed. Even now, Warrakurna is remote. Decades ago, it felt unreachable. Break down out there in the past, and there was no phone call to make, no instant help. You waited, and waiting taught patience in a way modern life never will. Out here, panic didn't help you. Preparation did. Then there's Oodnadatta, once a vital railway town, once full of purpose. But when routes changed, Oodnadatta was left behind. Not abandoned, just forgotten. The town didn't collapse. It simply slowed. People left. Buildings aged. And silence filled the gaps. Yet those who stayed didn't see it as a dead town. They saw it as home. Marble Bar is another name older Australians remember well. Known for heat records that sound impossible, days so hot the air itself felt heavy. But families lived there anyway. Children grew up there, people worked there, Life continued, because isolation wasn't a reason to leave. It was a challenge to accept. In places like Marble Bar, you didn't complain about conditions, you respected them. Across Australia, towns like Halls Creek, Wilcannia, and Inaminka played similar roles. They weren't destinations, they were lifelines, places where travellers rested, where supplies were gathered, where people knew they weren't alone in the middle of nowhere. And that knowledge mattered. In isolated towns, community wasn't optional. You knew your neighbours because you needed to. You noticed when someone hadn't been seen. You checked in without being asked. Modern life calls this community spirit. Out there, it was simply common sense. Children in these towns grew up differently. They learned responsibility early. They learned patience. They learned how to fix things instead of replacing them. They learned that help might not come quickly, so you thought before acting. Life moved slower, but it moved with intention. As Australia modernised, many of these towns lost their reason to exist. Technology shortened distances, transport changed routes, and services consolidated into larger centres. Slowly, the isolation that once made these towns essential made them expendable. Some towns faded quietly, some vanished entirely. Others remain, held together by people who refuse to let them go. Ask an older Aussie about these places, and they won't talk about population numbers or infrastructure. They'll talk about heat, distance, and people. About breakdowns fixed with borrowed tools. About floods that cut roads for months. About nights so quiet you could hear the wind moving across the land. They'll talk about resilience without ever using the word, because to them, it was just life. Most Australians today will never experience this kind of isolation, and maybe that's a good thing. But the country we live in was shaped by people who did. People who lived far from comfort, far from convenience, and far from recognition. Their stories aren't glamorous, they don't trend, they don't go viral, but they matter. Because once the roads disappear, once the buildings crumble, once the last residents leave, all that remains is memory. And memory only survives if someone tells the story. So if you remember one of these towns, if you lived in one, if you passed through when Australia felt bigger and quieter, those memories are part of this country too, and they deserve to be remembered.